Hi guys, it is time for 2015 reading statistics. I asked on Twitter if anybody would be interested in this type of video and everyone was like, yes, I got a very positive response, so I'm going to do it. I'm going to give you some numbers and charts and graphs describing my reading in 2015 because I can. I'm going to be reading a lot of this from my notes, so I'm sorry if I seem like I'm looking down all the time. I am actually looking down all the time. First, I'm going to talk about my 2015 reading list. This was one of my goals to read the 54 books on that list, things I picked out that I wanted to read in the past year, and I did really well at this. I mean, that was a really big list. I read 48 of the 54, I DNF'd one of them, and I had 5 unread, and I will get to those 5 in 2016. Now on to books in general. I read 243 books in 2015. I think I read 215 in 2014, so that was a significant bump. For some reason, Goodreads is saying that I read 244. I cannot figure out where this discrepancy has come in, but I keep my own spreadsheet with a lot more information and it says 243 and I trust that more than Goodreads' system right now, so I'm right, they're wrong. 29 or 12% of the books that I read were rereads, and since rereading childhood favorites was another one of my 2015 goals, I was really happy with this number. I mean, more than 10% of the books I read this past year were rereads, and I enjoyed doing that so much. I would kind of like to replicate this in 2016. I read roughly 83,000 pages, which works out to 342 pages on average per book. One of my 2015 goals, which I kind of ditched because it was really stressing me out, was to raise my average page length from 320, which is what it was in 2014, to 340, and I was having a really hard time balancing really long books with the really short books that I was rereading, and I just could not reach this number in the first half of 2015. So I deleted it from my spreadsheet so that I couldn't see that statistic, and lo and behold, it fixed itself. I read more longer books in 2015 and it all averaged out to 342 pages per book, and that beat my goal actually. Speaking of longer books, I read 69 books over 400 pages, 27 of those were over 500 pages, and 5 were over 900 pages. Next is genre. I think everybody likes seeing the pie chart of genres. This was a science fiction heavy year for me. 79 science fiction, 53 fantasy, which is a surprisingly high number. I feel like I did not read as much fantasy in the past year, but I did. It was just not like epic high fantasy. It was mainly other types of stuff. I read 21 trade comics, 17 nonfiction books, 11 classics, 10 middle grade or children's books, 10 mysteries, which was quite low, but I finished a historical mystery series and I just didn't continue with other mysteries after that. I read 7 memoirs, 7 young adult novels, 6 literary fiction novels, 5 plays, which were the 5 Shakespeare plays that I had on my 2015 reading list. I also read 17 other books from categories that I read 4 or fewer books in, and those include things like humor, steampunk, and historical fiction. Now for the formats I read books in. Apparently I love trade paperbacks. No surprise, I usually want to buy trade paperbacks when I'm buying my own stuff. I like them more than hardbacks. They're not as heavy, they're not as expensive. So no, not surprising, I read 94 trade paperbacks, 68 hardcovers, I believe many of those were library books, 38 ebooks, 28 audiobooks, 14 mass market paperbacks, and 1 other. I don't remember what that one was, but apparently it didn't fit into my usual format categories. And where did I get books? I really like seeing where I get books because I always aim to get more from the library than anything else. 98 books were my own, 75 were from my local libraries, 37 were from Overdrive, 12 were from interlibrary loan, and that is a lower number than I expected for this past year, but I think that's explained because I was having a really hard time getting my interlibrary loans filled in a timely manner from one of my libraries. It's a particular situation unique to my library. It's, I ended up not doing interlibrary loans for a while, and then I switched to my other library system and it just started working a lot better. So I hope to keep up on interlibrary loan this year, because I can tell the more I use ILL, the less I am buying books, just because it's easier and faster to acquire them that way than wait for it to come through ILL. I got 11 audiobooks from Audible, 6 books from Project Gutenberg, and 1 each from a publisher, NetGalley, a website, or borrowed from another person. One thing that I started tracking for the first time in 2015 was publication year, the original publication year of what I read, because I saw some other people talking about this in some statistics videos, and I thought that would be really interesting to see how old the things are that I am reading. So the 243 books I read spanned 422 years, from 1593, which was a Shakespeare play, to 2015. The average publication year was 1985. I read 5 books from the 1600s, 7 from the 1800s, 1 from the 1920s, 7 from the 1930s, 1 from the 1940s, 6 from the 1950s, 12 from the 1960s, 19 from the 1970s, another 12 from the 1980s, 31 from the 1990s, 37 from the 2000s, and 105 from the 2010s. And to break that last number down a little bit, I read 37 books from 2014 and 36 from 2015. So I was pretty heavily weighted towards newer books from the last 15 years or so, instead of books prior to about 2000. Now it's time for some author statistics. I read books by 127 different authors, or author combos, author teams, collabs, whatever you want to call that. And 83, yes, 65% of those authors were new to me in 2015. 45% of them were male, 53% of them were female, and 2% were both. I did not consistently categorize my both stuff, but even if I went back and fixed that, I don't think it would have a significant impact on these ratios at all. I also like to break down author gender by books and not just by author. And what I mean by that is I take it out of the number of total books rather than just the number of unique authors. So this is the second year that this particular statistic has happened to me. 58% of those 243 books I read were by women versus 53% of the 127 authors I read were women. What I think this means, I interpret this to mean that I am more likely to read multiple books by a single female author than a single male author. I think it shows that a lot of my favorite authors are women, and I read in this past year a bunch of series by women, so I was reading multiple books by women and not as many multiple books by men. Does that make sense? Anyway, it's a slightly different way of looking at the whole author gender thing and your preferences. And the final statistic is countries of where authors came from. And I'll be honest with you, I dumped a lot of my diversity statistics from my spreadsheet early in 2015 because I wasn't comfortable doing them. I wasn't sure how to categorize people. And the only one that I tried to keep ultimately was my column for an author's country of origin, like their ethnicity. It was really hard to do this, and I can tell you that about 80% of the authors I read were from the United States. I didn't even bother to try to break that number down more specifically and get more specific numbers out of it because it was just pretty abysmal. I mostly read books by authors from the United States, and if they weren't from the United States, they were from the UK. I need to diversify that. In fact, I think I do a better job of randomly picking up books by authors who are LGBTQ+ rather than from another country than I live in. I don't know why this is. Probably because if I rely heavily on my libraries to get books, given where I am in this country and given the types of books that my libraries require and what's available in the US, it's gonna be US publication companies publishing US authors, and so you have to go out of your way to get non-US books to buy them, and it's not necessarily an option for me all the time, so I'm really disappointed in that one. I would like to read more diversely, but it's very hard, I think so far, to get diverse works and science fiction and fantasy where I live if I rely on the library. I have to buy diverse things. I don't know, maybe I should just reserve my book buying budget for like translated science fiction or something, but yeah, that one was the only real disappointment in my statistics. That's it. This is gonna be a pretty long video, so thank you for sitting here through the numbers and charts. Let me know what your 2015 statistics were. Did anything surprise you? Did anything disappoint you? Please leave them in the comments down below, and I will talk to you guys again later. Bye.